Hey everyone. Thank you guys so much for joining us for the screening of the GIVERNY document. Um, Tavia is here with us. How are you?
I'm doing good. Thank y'all for watching. That's really special to me that so many people tuned in. And I hope y'all are going to stay for the Q&A because that's going to be exciting.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting, I think, in this moment where, museums are actively creating digital content to put together and what's being chosen. And I think, for us, one of the reasons why we chose film is obviously because we had this incredible Hammer project that we put together, your 3-channel version, the Giverny Suite. And, obviously that, had to close because of COVID. And not only that, but you opened this incredible show at Paula Cooper Gallery in New York. Um, and so I think something that your work does is it's so in line with the times, but it also builds on the past and the future and the present simultaneously. So thank you for that.
And thank you for your work on the Hammer project. It was an extraordinary experience. Thank you. And Erin, you've been super helpful to me throughout my entire practice with Black Radical Imagination. So I really want to shout you out right now for screening the early works and making a space for me in a lot of these places where there was none. So thank you. And Amir George, who is your Black Radical partner.
Shout out.
Shout out Amir.
So we're going to go into questions, but just a reminder, if you do have questions, email them to qanda@hammer.ucla.edu, and we'll basically try to answer as many questions as we can throughout this conversation. So just send them on in. So I think I wanted to start with, this lingering yet loaded question of, do you feel safe? Which is a question that we're all asking ourselves right now in this moment. But particularly how this notion of safety is often so precarious for Black women. But not only that, I think it's a notion that is constantly, something that we negotiate in terms of our survival. And so I know that recently you posted this really amazing video of this young Black woman who works for Amazon, who was on strike. And one of the things she said to the reporter was, I don't feel safe. They're lying about how many cases are in the country. And I just thought that, again, this just sort of beautiful moment in which our reality and your cinematic world are coming together. So can you sort of walk us through why that was a particular question that you chose to lead this project?
Yeah, I mean, it's really weird because it's such a fundamental question, but not a lot of people think about this. Not everyone has to wake up every day and consider, do I feel safe right now leaving my house, or do I feel safe in my house? That's not necessarily at the forefront of everyone's mind, but for some of us, this is a question that we do have to think about often. And I think what's so fascinating in the film is that I'm asking this question to Black women and girls, all different ages, from various points on the globe. It's a transnational, transdiasporic, intergenerational conversation. But some of them, they think that the answer is yes, and then there's a moment where they're like, well, wait a minute, because they've never had to, no one has ever asked them this before. Maybe they've thought it, but no one has ever considered this. And so for me, I wanted to get at this kind of fundamental positioning, this fundamental way of being that I think is absent sometimes from our mindset. And the reason why this came up is because I was in Giverny, France in 2016. That's how I got to go to these gardens, this Claude Monet garden. I was there for an artist residency, and it was beautiful. It's a lap of luxury. I was very blessed to get this. It was my first residency, but it was very difficult for me. I was the only Black person there. And there were a few moments where I felt the precarity of my body. I felt very vulnerable while I was working, while I'm moving throughout the space. There was an incident where I encountered a man, or There were incidences where I was hyper visible. You know, people were like, "Who the fuck is this lady?" Or I was completely invisible to the point where people were walking into me. So I felt my body in a very kind of profound and visceral way. And I was wondering, what does that mean, you know, for everybody else, for other women and other people, specifically Black women? Additionally, there was so much violence happening summer 16. I don't know if you remember Alton Sterling, Philando Castile, the Pulse nightclub shooting. So that's why I opted to use that particular video, Diamond Reynolds' Facebook Live video, because I wanted to show the contrast between these two experiences. When you are in the lap of luxury, right, and you have arrived, you at the seat of the you have a seat at the table, but you still feel that precarity. You still feel like the rug can be pulled out from under you at any moment. Furthermore, what is your responsibility, you know, to the people who are not at the table? So in many ways, it's also a kind of class critique, an interracial class critique, because we understand that the closer we are, the more proximity we have to power and money, and whiteness and wealth and all of those things and luxury, that oftentimes we do feel safe, right? We feel a semblance of safety, but I wanted to trouble that a little bit. Fred Moten says, has this really great quote. He said it at Black Artist Retreat in 2015. He said, upward mobility means getting closer and closer to the people who want to kill you. And I thought, God damn, you know, right? Leave it to Fred Moten to just like snatch you up a little bit. And I felt that, but it was also like, but you're not Diamond Reynolds right now. You're not living a waking nightmare right now. So it's difficult. There's a tension inherent. And I really, really wanted to ask other women on the street using this Vox Populi technique, you know, how they feel.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think, you know, this even speaks to, you know, this notion of isolation, something that we're all sort of physically dealing with in this moment, but oftentimes I think it's so sort of overlooked in terms of the mental and emotional isolation that we as Black folks, and particularly Black women, feel in these spaces that you're speaking of. You know, this perfectly manicured, beautiful garden, yet you feel a sense of sort of isolation or a sense of
Absolutely.
self-containment.
Yes, absolutely. For the first month, I was there for 2 months. For the first month, I was completely depressed. I did nothing. You know, I was in bed. You know, I would walk around the gardens or walk around the adjacent space and just pluck petals from the flowers and adhere them to clear film strips. So that's what you're seeing, these kind of glitching moments that look like microscopic biological material. That's flower petals or leaves from the actual garden. I had to do something to kind of not burrow into my head. It was very much, you know, like a James Baldwin Stranger in the Village moment. Like, where the fuck am I? What's happening? You know, but then also feeling like I needed to perform a certain amount of gratitude because it is, if we're talking about artist residencies, it's a top tier artist residency. So I'm also like, you know, thank y'all, you know, like, I'm really happy to be here. But, you know, I want to make sure I survive, you know, intact here.
Yeah, and I think, you know, sort of, you know, you referenced Diamond Reynolds. I think what was very clear to me throughout the film is that there's sort of four central characters, you know, four goddesses, if you will, that sort of anchor projects. You know, you have Nina Simone, who's the high priestess, right? You
Oh,
have
yeah.
you have Diamond Reynolds, who is sort of the soldier in action, right? You have Jatavia Gary, who's the poet, um,
The Negroes.
the Negress. And then you also have Josephine Baker, who is, you know, sort of this Renaissance, you know,
Mhm.
dance, song, acting. I mean, this woman, you know, was someone who decided to exile, leave the US, become a French citizen, was the first Black woman in any major feature film, was also a French resistance agent, you know,
Mhm.
and
Complicated.
complicated indeed. And so I kind of wanted to get your ideas around, you know, why these four characters sort of converging in this project and how are they all sort of related to each other?
Well, I've already talked a little bit about myself and Diamond, right? These two kind of this tension between the Black elite, let's say, because that's in some respect that is what the Negress, my character in the garden, represents. These Black folks who have been able to ascend, right? And it's a self drag, right? I've had educational privilege. I'm not poor anymore. I come from working class people, farmers, factory workers, preachers, but I'm the hope and the dream of these people, right? So, go and do good. And then Diamond Reynolds, someone who is living a waking nightmare, who is coming up against, the arm of the state, violence of the state in a very real and material way. So this is a comparing and contrasting, but also, like the tension that we talked about. We introduced Nina Simone, though, because I'm interested in always, in all of the work, in what people call interiority, right? And that's just a big word, but it can mean a number of things. For me, it means a few. The interior space of myself and other Black people, the psychological space, the emotional landscape, right? And that's what Nina is giving us. She's giving us a kind of tour force. She's taking us through all of the emotions, a full range of emotions with this one song. She's wrestling with the artist. She's wrestling with herself. Some might say she's completely slain in the spirit. But she's singing this Albert Moore song from the 70s, 1976, Feelings. And in her hands, it becomes something indescribable, right? And I feel like this is something that, for me, is so poignant. I've been revisiting this video since like maybe mid-20s. You know those videos on YouTube that you keep coming back to? And this is something for me because she struck a chord with me, what it means to be that emotionally present and emotionally resonant takes a certain amount of courage. It takes a certain amount of wherewithal. And I'm obsessed, basically. And I feel like she's bringing in this kind of interior psychic realm, but also the spiritual realm. We don't call her the high priestess for nothing. This is an artist who, for me, has modeled what it means to completely be at the mercy of spirit when you're creating, right? This is a courageous human being who put, checks and bags on the line, who put her reputation on the line to speak out, right, against the forces of evil, right, who are still very much at work and at play in this moment. So to me, she is a model. Whenever I can use her, I'm going to put her in a film. And she does a lot of heavy lifting in this work. It's also a reparative gesture, right? Because in a lot of popular culture, and even in narrative films and documentary films, Nina Simone's legacy, it's shaky for me as a stan. It's shaky how we have looked back at her legacy and how we portray her legacy. So for me, this was me attempting to repair some of the damage that has been done from other cinematic gestures in the past. Now, Josephine Baker. Josephine Baker is complicated. Both Nina Simone and Josephine Baker have these relationships to France, right? And it's a complicated relationship because, as we know, Black Americans have gone to France, whether you're talking about jazz folks or you're talking about writers, Baldwin, right, Richard Wright, etc. They have gone to France and they've sought a kind of retreat or a kind of, a break from the overt white supremacy that comes with being a Black American, right? And it's complicated because on one hand, yes, it's different. It's not necessarily the same sort of violence, but it is a violence, nonetheless. And so I wanted to complicate her allegiance to France in a way. Also, Josephine Baker, and it takes Dr. Terry Francis to talk about her, and I'll reference her right now. She's a film scholar, and she's written about Josephine Baker and her kind of animated burlesque. And what Josephine Baker represents to me is this kind of sexuality that is not foreclosed upon. And you would assume that it was because it's the 1930s and 1940s and she's a Black woman living in a Black woman's body. But she is engaging with her sexuality in a way that's incredibly daring, and it's not beholden to white supremacy. It's not even the white supremacy in France. So I feel like even though she is in this cage, right? There's a certain sort of agency that Josephine Baker is embodying through her presence. So I wanted the viewer to kind of think about what these figures mean to them in relation to each other, but also the rest of the footage. I hope that answers your question. I feel like I'm rambling.
And I think that leads me into a question about love, actually. Because, you know, something that I found sort of deeply personal in watching this is the sort of continued heartbreak that all of these characters employ throughout the film. As you mentioned, you know, you have Nina, who is clearly, you know, working, pushing through this song. And
Mm-hmm.
there's sense of heartbreak that you sense from her. And I think, you know, in reading her autobiography and knowing more about her legacy, you know, you realize that she, you know, I'm thinking particularly about, you know, her husband, who was a former New York police officer, who then became her manager, who was known for physically assaulting her. You know, I think of Josephine Baker in that particular film, Zuzu, in which she is the only Black woman in this. And the reason she even performs is in hopes of making some money to bail out her lover, a white man, who then goes to run off with a white woman.
Yes.
Of course, we have Diamond, who is dealing with this very real moment. You know, that's, you know, she's witnessing this alongside her daughter. So I think, you know, these ideas of love as it relates to Black women are very deep, and I think, you know, something I was very grateful for, because I think oftentimes we rarely get to see, as you know, you would even say, these multivalent sort of experiences and identities of ourselves. So can you sort of talk about this notion of love? I think your love is the sort of reparative gestures that you're doing work, but can you tell us a little more about that?
Yeah, I mean, well, everything, and this is going to sound cheesy, but I mean, is love not at the crux of all of the work that I'm trying to do, right? I feel like whether it's an ecstatic experience or this particular film or the film that I'm making with my family, the evidence of things not seen, it's really about these gestures of care and these efforts towards healing, which are all bound up within the practice of love, specifically Black people attempting to love each other, which is super fucking difficult, right? If you think about it. Like in the context of this history of violence, which has fractured all of our relationships, but also Black people attempting to heal and love themselves. So a lot of these women, like I said, especially Nina, they're models for me, having gone through tremendous amounts of trauma, but have been able to use their creative practices and their personal relationships to kind of transmute the terror, right? The emotional terror, or even the physical terror that they've been subject to. Um, I don't know. I'm a Leo, and when I think about Leos, of course, a lot of people think, you know, self-aggrandizement and, you know, being extra and look at me, and of course that's all a part of it, right? Everybody wants to be loved, basically. But I also think about this idea of courage, this idea of being the person who, you know, will put themselves on the line, the person who's going to say that thing that might not win them any friends, might not make them money, that's might indeed alienate them completely, but is necessary, right? And so I see my practice as that. I could switch up and make some cheesy shit, right, and get a bag, right? We could all collect our bags. It's some Black people having a moment. We could all collect our bags. But I think for me, the challenge is to be courageous in my practice and what I'm trying to say in regards to Black folks and our position in society, but also the form, how the shape that the work takes. Those are acts of courage and those are acts of care, because I'm trying to do something that is going to challenge the viewer to think about our reality differently. You know, making films is some really powerful stuff. It shapes your perception. That's why not everybody gets to do it. That's why mostly white guys get to do it. They get to decide what reality is for everyone else. So now that I have these tools and I have this ancestral mandate, it's up to me to necessarily not be a cowardly lion, right? To be a real live human being, a real live artist who is not concerned with, popularity, so to speak, or money, or, even influence to a certain degree. Whoever sees the film is going to see the film. So for me, the project is about healing. The project is about showing us in our expansive, multivalent reality. And ultimately, it's about love, as cheesy as it sounds.
Oh, I think it all comes back to that. And you feel that through the work. And I think that's why people are so grateful for it when they witness it.
I'm grateful when people watch it.
Well, girl, I think about 800 folks watched it today. So
yeah. There's some questions in the chat though.
Yeah. Let's see here.
That's what I keep looking at.
Question here, Jatavia, when conducting the interviews with women in Harlem, was your appearance important? I'm thinking about that wig you were wearing.
Well, that wig, I call her Pamela, honey. She's in the closet right now, Miss Pam. I have two wigs, Honey and Pam. Those of you who follow me on Instagram, y'all know who Honey looks like. The wig that I'm wearing in the film is called Pam. And it was important for me to switch up, right? I wanted to occupy multiple subject positions, and not disguise myself or not don a character, so to speak, but to shift it a little bit. And I knew that if I went out into the streets of Harlem and interviewed people like this, it would be a totally different situation. Like walking around with a shaved head is pretty intense for people and for myself, the reaction that I get. So I wanted to kind of mediate the extreme reaction, and I wanted to kind of blend in. Additionally, that style, this bob, is a reference to the 1960s. So this idea of interviewing on the street, this question even, is a reference to a film called Chronicle of a Summer by Jean Rouch and Edgar Morin. It is the first cinema verite film. It's a French film, 1961. And in the film, there's a woman named Marceline who opens the film with woman on the street interviews. She's asking French people, are you happy? And with this one question, she opens up this huge discourse around work, love, death, marriage, children, etc. Like this one ethnographic query sets the stage for the entire film. So for me, I took this technique, right? This early cinema verite technique, and I took the question and I flipped it. And not are you happy, are you safe? And I only spoke to Black women. It was important for me to narrow, or as Morrison would say, broaden, right? When I only think about Black women, I can get to the root of something. It's imperative for me to really center the position, the lived experiences, the reality of Black women, because I can get to the real kernel of that. To me, that specificity is important. It's not narrow. Simone Lee says, that's actually a really quite broad audience. Like there's millions of people, that's hundreds of languages, there's, dozens of countries. It's an expansive group of people. So the hair, to get back on track, the hair is a reference to the 1960s without giving you some full-fledged costume. It's also a way of kind of like tempering my everyday presentation, right? So that people can feel more welcome. Sometimes when you're walking around with a shaved head, people be like, who the hell was going on? But only the strong can pull something like this off. Thank you for that question.
I wanted to ask really about, you referenced sort of the of the film, and I'm thinking about the texture and the fabric. I think that's felt, as you go from format to format, you really sort of see these texture changes, these scale changes and ratio. And for me, it was actually really brought me back to just sort of an artistic tradition that stems from the American South, so of course I immediately think about painting, I think about weaving, these things that are sort of originally placed as women's work. And I'm thinking about how your project essentially is an extension of that practice. It is very much the cinematic quilt. can you sort of talk about that and origin? I mean, from Texas. And yeah, and I feel like, there is something of that coming through. I often feel like, so many of these traditions from the American South, particularly as they come into the canon, right, sort of get placed into these categories of, what is folk art, or, some of these categories that tend to sort of reduce actually
Yeah,
the brilliance of these works.
absolutely. A lot of this, absolutely. And I love that you call it a cinematic quilt. I say that too. I call them, they feel like, they're collages, right? It's bricolage. It's taking these seemingly disparate materials and weaving them together. And it's very much in line with this Southern Black feminine tradition of quilting, but also cooking, taking the scraps and making something functional and beautiful. And that could also be handed down, right? Something that is an heirloom, or something that has a survival mechanism that's a part of it, that we want the other people to, the folks who come after us, to have. So it's the practice that I engage in, whether it be the editing, the animation. Of course, it falls under this idea of women's work. These, as other people will say, these 1970s considerations of women's work and feminist work. But of course, I'm being very specific here because I'm thinking about Black women and the Black women who raised me, right? And these traditions that they hold on to. So for me, it's almost like second nature. It's intuitive, and I don't run from ideas or labels of craft. You can call me a folk artist. I mean, I went to school, so I'm trained. I'm a trained filmmaker. But there have been people who have tried to label the work as craft in an attempt to denigrate, and I welcome this. To me, the craft element of my film is what is, it's a sustaining element for me. Sitting down and etching for hours a day and for months on end. This is again an example of the care ethic in practice. This idea of tarrying with the material, with who's ever in the frame, even, right? Looking at Ruby Dee's face over and over again, from that ecstatic experience clip, there's a certain familiarity and intimacy that's occurring as I'm working this footage. Also, what is being transferred, right, between myself and the material? People ask me all the time, "Oh, what software are you using to do that?" I'm like, "Hun, I'm giving you hands right now. I'm giving you hours and hours of, just like intense focus with my hands." And I think that there is an exchange that's going on there. And that's what people can feel when they watch the work. They're feeling a kind of like an emotional resonance. They're feeling a human life force that's kind of coming up off of the screen and off of the material. And you can call me craft all day if I'm going to give that. And I feel like that's what the tradition gives, and that's what the tradition entails, this exchange with the material. It's not just for form's sake. It's not just to be fancy. It's to me a healing modality, above all. This is me trying to work through some shit, quite frankly.
Yeah, and I think to your point about this notion of the film sort of expanding and sort of through these various formats and through these ratios, I also see that in the way that you treat this particular project from iteration to iteration.
Somebody's ringing you, girl. You popular, girl.
But I see that through, iteration through iteration, because, what I found so amazing about this project is that, it is its own sort of entity. It's this, short film, then it's this feature film, then it's 3-channel installation. And I think there's something very important to be said about someone who sort of found this perfect lane between both the art world and the film industry, and that you're able to make something that you can manipulate on either side.
Yeah, I mean, she's crafty above all, right? And I think, you know, all of that comes out of the need to, I mean, the idea of making one's own lane, that's necessity. You know, the film world isn't necessarily rolling out a red carpet for somebody who's making incendiary, political, subjective art documentaries, experimental documentaries. I mean, I'm not saying that they wouldn't, but there's certain things that there's certain changes that I would have to undergo. I have friends who are in these spaces, and there are multiple compromises. There are multiple, you know, it's a struggle. You know, they're struggling in their spirit, they're struggling in their practice. And I'm not saying I'm not struggling in my spirit and my practice, but I haven't had to do too many gut checks with my integrity as of yet. And so, yes, I am straddling a line. I'm existing within a liminal space. I can make a short film that can play in festivals and play in cinemas, but also be exhibited in a gallery space or a museum space. And then I can add to it and make it a 40-minute film that exists within a 3-channel installation. So that's exciting to me, because occupying space and thinking of space as a material is very fascinating. Considering mise-en-scene outside of the production realm, but in a gallery setting, to me, that's exciting. Like, how can I trick out this space and create an atmosphere? How can I welcome spirit into this space with objects and not just projection, right? So it's just me not wanting to be bound, right? When people say, oh, what type of films we make, I don't like saying experimental, but I say experimental because there's no other genre really. There's 3 or 4 genres that are happening at one time. When I made GIVERNY Integris Symbols, to me, it was my version of The Sunken Place. I was like, this is a horror film. This little bit right here this is a horror film. And then it expands and it becomes this art documentary, right? And some people are like, this isn't a documentary. So I have no space necessarily for labels or even for, you know, art world, film world. I'm just here. And I welcome you all to join me. That's really what it is.
And taking up space, which I find is really important.
That's also one of the key themes of this film. Mm-hmm. You know, taking up space. Like, who gets to take up space and who gets squashed? Mm-hmm. You know, this idea of existing. My pure existence is this kind of political act in certain context.
Yeah, I think, you know, again, just going back to these images of GIVERNY and seeing your body, you know, with this background of leaves and foliage, it's very, again, it's just so ironic to both, you know, see visually, aesthetically, see this beauty, but then sort of feel your inner workings and your isolation. So, there's some more questions here. So
yeah, let's hit up some of these questions from folks out there in TV land. Shout out to Nikita Gale.
Yes.
Her in the question. She wants to know, how do we mobilize safety among women of color today? I think that's a really, really good question, because I feel like, and I told Erin I wasn't going to go too far with my politics, but I was watching Democracy Now! Either yesterday or today, and Juan Gonzalez is one of the journalists on Democracy Now! And Juan said that these protests with these armed people who want to go outside, that feels like a kind of, you know, something is in the air, and it feels like, you know, we might be moving to a kind of neo-fascist authoritarian state, right? So safety for a lot of people is at the forefront of their minds, right? If you are someone who's in one of these states where people are organizing themselves, not for healthcare, they're not organizing themselves for more support, more financial support from the government. They're not organizing themselves for PPE for the medical workers. They're organizing so that you can get back to work, so that they can have their hair done, or, you know, whatever other shit that they need to do. So this is a good question. I feel like I'm not gonna tell people, because I don't know where everybody lives. Everybody lives in different states. I live in a state where people carry guns. And to me, I don't think it makes sense for everyone else to have a gun. And mind you, I don't have a gun. I don't. But it's weird that everyone else has one, and I'm not. If I'm an intellectual radical artist, and I'm not supposed to have one. That makes me very nervous. But I think that there are ways that Black women, women of color, Latinx women, and Native women can come together and create communities of support where they learn to defend themselves. Maybe they read up on the ways that people have defended themselves in the past. They organize themselves in cadres or in collectives that are focused specifically on self-defense. Like, what does it mean to care for ourselves and care for our children and the most vulnerable in our communities during such a heightened and chaotic time where our lives are under threat, not just from a pathogen, but from people who have fascistic tendencies. We'll just say that, right? People who are interested in authoritarian violence, anti-Black violence. That hasn't gone away just because people aren't marching in the streets. So I think that's a really good question. And I think these things need to be localized, you know. Think about the people in your neighborhood. Think about the people in your building. Think about the people in your families. But I'm in a state where people are carrying guns. So I'm thinking on a lot of levels. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I think it also just comes back to, what you were saying, these ideas of care. I mean, what's been actually really healing for me is I've been in several little, text groups and groups, and it's just we've all just been sharing, our different skills.
Yeah. Yeah.
Comes back to that, like skill sharing, like people making masks for each other, people sharing recipes,
mutual aid. Yeah.
And those are things that have really lifted my spirit because, I think what we don't talk about is women of color and mental health,
Right.
all the things that we go through. So I think, again, the fact that we are not only dealing with, these sort of mental implications, but we're also physically isolated from the rest of our people in our community. What are alternative ways of relating to our community?
Mm-hmm. I think getting together and talking about what's happening internally is also a way that you organize around safety, right? I think this idea of this isolation is going to have a profound effect. And I think a lot of people aren't concerned about their mental health as much as they are concerned about their physical health right now. But the isolation is going to take its toll. It's already taking its toll on many of us. So I feel like getting out in front of that, right? And collectivizing, you can, organize yourself around meditation, organize yourself around sharing a kind of testimony moment. Where you come together and talk about what you're going through. That's one way of like leaning on each other and moving through this situation, collectively. That's a good question though. There's some other ones.
Yeah. Jatavia, can you talk about your relationship to the idea of haunting a bit? This film feels like a seance. It makes me think so much about agency and haunting in a way that you are on one hand, allowing yourself to be haunted by the archival image of Nina and Diamond and Josephine, or allowing yourself to absorb them. And then it feels as if you are haunting the image of the gardens of Giverny. You're haunting this site of Western cultural production and taking up this position to being everywhere and also invisible.
Wow. That's a good question. That's a really great question. I want you to reveal yourself to me on Twitter, whoever wrote that question. That was phenomenal. Haunting is something that this isn't the first time someone has placed that term within the matrix of my work, right? Because I'm using archival footage, because I'm pointing to the past and attempting to apprehend and appropriate these images and events and figures from the past, it feels very much like a haunting. And I do have a spiritual practice and a spiritual tradition that convenes with spirit, that convenes with people who are on a different side. I won't go into it too much because I'm not one of those, that's not what I'm supposed to be doing right now, but it is present. My spiritual practice and my creative practice are very much working in tandem. And it is, and the fact that you say that this feels like a seance to you is really fascinating to me, because above all, I'm interested in making sure the emotional, like we said earlier, and psychological registers are being felt by the artist. By the viewer, right? Not simply by me. And of course, I'm just a conduit, right? I'm just sitting here at the computer using the tools that were given to me and the information that was given to me, the techniques that were given to me, and the materials that are at my disposal. Because I'm pulling from the archive, things get a little tricky, right? These, whether they be physical film strips or digital clips, these things have a life. They have an energy to them, right? And so when you mix them together, when you start putting, Nina Simone next to Claude Monet and then Fred Hampton and then myself, there's going to be a reaction. These are not empty, these are not dead, these are not flat things. They are very much alive. And they come with not only their own energy, they come with their own context, right? And so this idea of, right, the Kuleshov effect, when I put a flower next to a gun, it creates a new image, it creates a new thought in my head. That's what I'm doing with these images from the archive. John Akomfa would call it affective proximity. The key word being affective, right? This notion of affect, this idea that you are having some sort of emotional play or reaction based on what you're seeing. So it's very much my goal for people to feel haunted by the past. I want you to try to make connections between what has happened and what was done and what was said and what's going on right now. I want you to sense the urgency of the moment. That was a multi-part question, so I'm trying to go through all of it. Yeah, I very much felt like a ghost in that space. Like I said, I was invisibilized. And what does it mean when my Black body comes into Claude Monet's garden? He didn't make that garden for me. He made that garden to look at the lilies, the lily pads in that lake, in that pond. So what happens when I come and I activate this, bringing everything that I'm bringing, right? A descendant of enslaved Africans from the American South. What happens when I bring my great grandmother, Lila Amerson, with me into the garden, right? I'm taking up space. I hope that answers your question.
Oh, I think that.
I feel like I'm talking too much.
No, well, please.
We're here for a Q&A, that's right. I forgot.
But yeah, no, I love that you mentioned the compro because I think he does this very well. And he actually uses this term hauntologies.
You curated a show called that, or curated a screening event called that.
Yeah, totally a term. Let's see here. Oh, can you talk about your usage of Integris symbols and the bodies of water in the film?
Wow. Okay. So yes, the bodies of water. I took 16 millimeter film from their clips from this film called The American Spectacle. And it's this educational film from the 1970s. And it's basically this guy, this news reporter, going all over the country and highlighting the beautiful majesty of the United States, right? The topography. So he's going to Yellowstone, he's going to the Redwood Forest, he's going to the canyons that you visited and you posted on your Instagram. I decided to take all of the water imagery from that film. So you have the Atlantic Ocean, Niagara Falls, and the Mississippi River in my film. And the reason why I do this, you see it at the beginning and the end of the film, these are homages or salutes, rather, to two Orisha, Yemaya, who has my head, and Oshun. These are both highly powerful maternal Orisha. They take offerings of flowers. They're associated with birds. Oshun is associated with honey and sweets and oranges and melons. They are associated with beauty and wealth and fertility. They are fecund, they are overflowing, but they are also protectors, right? And so for me, it was important because I am the daughter of two waters, both Yemaya and Oshun. It was important for me to acknowledge them in this work because this work is about women, right? And Oshun and Yemaya are the ultimate kind of maternal and womanly and feminine figures. So that's what the scratching on the film was about. The symbols are associated with these two orisha. One is about beauty and a comb. And so that's why I have put them on this particular strip of film. And they begin and they end the film, they kind of bookmark it. And the soundtrack is this woman named Shirley Ann Lee. How Can I Lose with the Help I Got? She's an early gospel singer. It sounds like blues, because blues and gospel used to kind of be the same thing almost. But yeah, this is a salute to these two powerful feminine entities that protect me and that protect women all over the diaspora. So it was important for me to have them there.
Yeah, and I think to your point about these bodies of water being so loaded, something that I learned recently was, obviously we all know how the Mississippi River was utilized, right?
Mm-hmm.
Induct enslaved peoples into this.
Right.
But
not
not
Atlantic Ocean.
Right. But actually the Niagara River was one of the final bodies of water that enslaved folks who ran away through the Underground Railroad would encounter before they decided they wanted to go to Canada.
Wow. I didn't know that.
You're basically telling the story of the transatlantic slave trade through these images, which I find
water. Wow, I didn't know that. That's incredible. Water is also water. These oceans, these lakes, these rivers are so complicated too, because water is, of course, the essential element of life. But for a lot of us who have survived or who are descendants of the transatlantic slave trade, or for folks who are descendants of recent migrants coming over, the ocean is this like vast graveyard of like bones. It's complicated, right? So I'm considering both. I'm considering all of the manifestations or the ways in which the ocean operates for people who look like us, for people who have similar histories or the same histories as us. So even the water imagery alone is just like super loaded. I didn't know that about the Niagara River though. I like being put on. Thank you.
I was working on my little essay and I was like, look at this.
Okay. It's been 40 minutes. Should we keep going?
Okay, so we're gonna do 5 more minutes.
5.
Girl.
Okay.
We can keep going. There's a few more questions. Let's see here.
Yikes. Shout out to everybody on Twitter. This is crazy. Shout out to my mama who's watching, my best friend Crystal, my friend Lucas, my friend Daniel, my friend William.
So this question here, I'd love to hear you talk about the term document, a verb, noun question, both, and what's your relationship to documentary and a related term, archives, which you kind of spoke about this a little bit, but I think that term, the GIVERNY document, is very specific.
Yes, I am a documentary filmmaker. Now that doesn't mean that I won't make, a romantic drama, which I hope to in the past, and I mean in the future. But I'm a trained documentary filmmaker. I went to undergrad at Brooklyn College and studied, documentary film production and Africana studies. Then I went to grad school and studied social documentary production. So I'm obsessed with documentary and nonfiction film as a practice and as a form, but I'm really interested in stretching it. I'm really interested in pushing the definition of what that can even mean, So for me, documentary is blown wide open. It could be anything. Just like the idea or the term a document can be anything. It doesn't necessarily have to be, some sort of like word portfolio. A document can be a note or a letter that I'm writing to someone in prison or a card that my grandmother gave me. It's really just, it's both noun and verb, as you're saying. So I wanted to kind of consider this as an essay film, and thinking through what the various forms and the various sequences would be and what they represent. So if you consider an essay, or you consider, kind of journal entry, where would the interviews exist and where would they lie? Where would the animation exist and where would it lie? And what is its purpose? How are we weaving Nina in and out? And what is its purpose? How are we engaging the archive as a kind of source, as a kind of source material? Or a footnote, or just like a quick reference, right? Someone else asked about Fred Hampton on this side. Fred is talking about the importance of political education, and it's something that I'm always stressing to myself and to my friends and to young people when I go talk at colleges, that it's easy for your movements to be co-opted or to be squashed if there is not political education at the root of these things, at the foundation of these things. Everyone gets really hot under the collar and they want to go out in the streets. But in order to sustain ourselves, there has to be this education. So that is what Fred is representing in that moment, in that film. Also, Fred is also connected to Philando Castile. He perished in a way that was quite similar to Philando Castile, with his wife, or his pregnant fiance by his side.
Literally.
So you see this. Sorry?
I was saying literally in bed with him at the time.
Literally in bed. So I wanted to connect the dots historically and contemporarily, that the state's persistent violence on Black families, right, has not come to an end. It has not ceased. That you see these repeated assaults, right? If you live long enough, you learn there's nothing new under the sun. And how can we look back? The document is something that you can look back on. The archive is something that you can look back on. How can we look back and use what we've learned, the mistakes, the successes, the ways in which they were targeted? How can we take that information and use it to shape our efforts moving forward?
Yeah, I wanted to also, realizing that we're going to enter, I wanted to talk about the installations in particular, because I think the reason that we're doing this is, obviously because both of these installations in New York and LA got cut short due to COVID. I was really interested, coming in from a curatorial perspective, in how you sort of thought through laying out the space, why you were thinking through 3-channel, the Salon style framing on the main wall, the settee that's sort of at a tilt, the Orisha that are with us in that space. There's so many new objects and elements that come into the installation. Can you sort of walk us through how you were thinking through that?
I just want to ask a question. Excuse me, Vanessa, are we still going, or has it been cut off? And then I'll answer. Just let us know in the chat. We're still going. Got it. So your question is good. I should say that initially it was a 3-channel from the 6-minute GIVERNY 1 Integris Imperial, that was a thing. And then I knew that it was going to be something else. That's why I called it GIVERNY 1. It became a 3-channel before it became the thing that we all just saw. So I went from 6-minute to 3 40-minute panels. I knew that I wanted to do this because I'm inspired by people like John Akamfa and how they're able to utilize space in a cinematic realm, right? So coming into a gallery space or a museum space allows me the opportunity to expand and to think about an immersive experience, right? Not just sitting in the theater, but what happens when I walk into a space and there are 3 screens, and I have taken the very meticulous care of designing and ordering what you're seeing in the room. So in the 3-channel, the installation that was at the Hammer and also at Paula Cooper, I was interested, and also at Gallery Franck Elbaz, that's where it was first, at my French gallery in Paris in January 2019. I don't want to forget them. But it was important for me to kind of gesture towards the living spaces of French, like this kind of historical French aristocracy, this notion of a salon. Because to me, it was fascinating that these frames, these repeated frames that are positioned on the wall, look kind of like a Black grandmother's house. Like if you go into your Black grandmama house and there's like a bunch, everybody's, graduation photo, wedding photos, they're up, they're on display, right? So to me, that was an interesting overlap, right? Also, this idea of this fancy settee, this couch, whether it be a chaise lounge or this kind of Baroque moments. I see this a lot in older Black women's spaces. I had a couch like this as well. It's an aesthetic choice that I feel like is present in both cultures, right? So for me, using it was like pointing to both of these and to the overlap. But they are distorted, right? So the sofa is on three legs. We've cut off one of the legs and tilted it. In the French and in the LA installation, we had our screens coming off the wall at these sharp angles. For me, I was really interested in kind of queering the space, right? Bringing movement into the space and turning things upside down. We are not static. We are not steady. There's motion. There's movement. Um, I wanted to upset this space. I wanted to create an irregularity in the space, which is how I felt in GIVERNY. I was the irregularity.
We nicknamed the settee Marie Antoinette.
There. There. Let them eat cake.
Right. That part. This is a really good one. Why did you decide to do the interviews in Harlem as opposed to spaces like Brooklyn or the Bronx?
Right. And it's crazy because I lived in Brooklyn for 17 years. So you would think that I would, station them on Nostrand Avenue in Bed-Stuy. But for me, I really wanted to go to Harlem. I knew that despite the ridiculous amount of gentrification that has and is occurring in that space, that I was going to be able to stand on a corner and encounter countless Black women from all over the globe. Also, Harlem has such historical resonance. Not to say that Brooklyn doesn't, not to say that the Bronx doesn't, but if we're talking about Black people, specific Black cultural and artistic movements, Harlem has, a resonance there. Also, Malcolm X Boulevard is key here too. A lot of people forget that Malcolm X was, and I'm not saying he didn't have a complicated relationship with women, because he did. Many Black men do. They have complicated relationships with the Black women in their lives. But Malcolm X was a champion of Black women, in addition to him speaking out publicly and about his politics and moving against the Nation of Islam in that way, he was also speaking out on behalf of Black women. And that was one of the reasons why he got ultimately silenced and alienated, because he was speaking truth to power, power being Elijah Muhammad, and his, unfortunate and ridiculous relationships with young Black women. Malcolm X was championing these folks. And this is how his career with the Nation of Islam, or his practice with the Nation of Islam, came to a halt. Not simply because he said these are the chickens coming home to roost, not simply because he was out preaching against police brutality when the nation wanted him to only focus on Islam. He was centering Black women's lived experiences and he was advocating on behalf of these young women who had no one, basically, in the face of such extreme power, that being Elijah Muhammad. So, there are multiple reasons why I was in Harlem. Also, that park it was necessary to be in that park because for another shot in the 3-channel, we needed a kind of overhang, and you don't see this shot in the single channel. You only see it in the 3-channel. But I needed to walk under a bridge to recreate a shot from Chronicle of the Summer. So there are a number of reasons.
Yeah, I think also in terms of Malcolm, I was just thinking about. Wasn't there an issue that he basically spoke up about the assassination of Kennedy, correct? And that was also
coming home to roost. Yeah, he said that, and people thought that was really callous in the moment. I thought it was really clear and cogent. In fact, I think about what he would be saying right now if he were alive. Like, would he be spitting fire right now? Or would he not? Because people change. I don't know. And he was known for changing. He was known for being transformative multiple times. That's what's so fascinating about him.
Here's I think a great just general question. What advice would you give to Black women who want to enter film or the art world? how do we make sure we feel safe in these spaces?
How do we make sure we're safe in these spaces? I mean, you got to get you a good group of people around you so that you can have real conversations about what will indeed happen to you when you enter into these spaces. I'm going to be very honest. Grad school was tough. Working as a young professional on other people's documentaries was extremely tough. I was met with systemic, institutionalized racism, white supremacy, misogyny. Fighting for my ideas still is tough. I think that you have to come in with a mission. Not to sound cheesy again, but it's very clear in my head what my project is. And when I say project, I mean the totality of my creative, trajectory. My project is about showing Black people our multivalence, showing how layered we are, right? Not just how positive we are. Not everybody's all positive, but how multi-layered we are. Healing, right? Seeing if we can use this medium of film and television to heal myself and others if they so choose. So I have this in my head, right? It's a kind of guidepost. And anything that comes my way, I have to measure it against that. Everything that I'm doing is working towards this project, working towards this mission. It allows me to stay firm in what I'm doing. It also strengthens me when I am under attack, because you will be under attack, let's be honest. Even if I was a white woman, I would be under attack. But because I am a Black woman who looks like this, I'm very much under attack when I'm trying to bring forth my vision. So you have to have clarity of vision. You have to be extremely tough. You have to believe in yourself when people say absolutely no. A no don't mean shit to me. I used to be an actor. I would get no's all the time. Rejection was a part of the practice, right? So that's something that strengthened me. When people say no, I say, okay, on to the next. In fact, I'm like, how dare you sometimes? Like, you need to get with the winning team, to figure out you're with. But you also have to take these no's as dodging a bullet sometimes. You also have to take these lessons, these lumps that you're inevitably going to get as dodging bullets, but also as these kind of strengthening experiences, So I would just stand firm in who you are, figure out what your vision is, and get people around you who will lift you up, support you. I've got really amazing friends. I've got a real strong mom. My mama don't play. She's a Southern Black woman, and these people, they pour into me and I pour into them, and it's reciprocal, and we lift each other up. So I hope that that's of help. Yeah. It's rough out there.
To young women who are thinking about curating or going into curating, it's really helpful just to write down, as you said, your mission statement. What is the work
Who are you?
And what are the exhibitions that you want to see through your own lens? Who are these artists and these themes that you want to bring together? And knowing that mission statement obviously will change over time because you are a changing, growing, evolving being. But it's something that I think, as you said, keeps you rooted in those moments where people question you and sort of question your intelligence. Something else, just in terms of my personal experience, is, work with your friends, as you said, build these collectives. Like, don't look towards the institution or these spaces to validate you, because they won't. Because they will validate you when someone else has validated you.
Right.
That's first.
Or when it's politically expedient to do so, when it's on trend to do so.
Right. And that's a whole other story. So I agree. I think, it's really about self-determination. It's about hustling, something that we all have learned to do. And I think it's about just pushing through, even when you get those no's, or even when, people, whatever, you just have to just get in there, center yourself really, and push forward. So I think we have to wrap up. It's been an hour. Do you want to answer maybe one more question, or do you want, is there any last words? You leave us with something.
Somebody asked, thank you for your work, sis. Since first meeting you, I've observed that you are one of the few artists in our extensive creative community who consistently save space in your process for creative elders, whether Uncle Arthur Jaffa, Fred Moten, or the spirit of Nina Simone and many others. Can you please speak on the intentionality behind this intergenerational relationship building and connections with elders has informed your art? Opio, thank you for that question. I think it's all about an intergenerational connection. When we talk about how fractured the Black community is, we talk about the fracturing between young people and old people as well, our elders and the young folks. That's a huge fracture. People forget that. We think often just the men and the women, gay and straight, you know, all of these binaries that have been created from violence, from this legacy of enslavement and colonialism. But for me, it really is about making these connections across generations. And there have been many artists, from Colleen Smith to Simone Lee, to Arthur, to Christopher Harris, all of these amazing filmmakers and sculptors and curators who have made space for me, you know, Theaster Gates, people who you look at online and you're like, there's no way I would ever be able to do what these folks do. But committing to the work and in a way, for me, it was about humbling myself too, and it still is. There are moments where I, of course, have to assert myself because, again, there is this chasm, right? Sometimes we don't acknowledge what the other person has to bring to the table because of this chasm. But it is a kind of respect and a good Southern humility. I feel like that was given to me by my mama, right? That, you know, these elders, they come and they're here to give you things, and there's things that you don't know. So for me, it has been a real honor, a real, you know, just like a real honor to have older artists accept the work, challenge the work even, you know. I've had Uncle Arthur sometimes is like, that's not good, you know, like, that doesn't seem cohesive. And to me, even that is great, right? Because we can learn from these critiques and we can share. So I consider myself very blessed and very lucky to even be in community with these folks. And I think the reason why they feel like they can do that is because I come to them and I ask, you know, it's really that simple. It has been really that simple for me. Simone Lee made space for me because I came to her as a graduate student and asked, hey, can I film you for my film, for my school project? She was getting ready for Basel and she said yes. And I will always be grateful for that type of generosity, right? Because I learned so much during that time. She told me really amazing things about that girded me and got me through grad school. And she put my mind on this trajectory of Black feminine subjectivity, that you need to know who you're talking to, and then you can forget about everybody else. What are you saying and who are you talking to? So I'm grateful, and I'm grateful to you, Erin. I'm grateful to the 870 people who tuned in. This has been really beautiful, and demand things from the government right now. You know, things are changing very swiftly, and we need to start demanding that our needs be met. This money that they're giving to these CEOs, that's your money. That's your tax money. We should be getting thousands of dollars every month to support us, and we should still be staying at home, right? So I want you guys to take care and be safe and get some sea kelp and some bladderwrack and some pau d'arco and, you know, shore up that immune system so that we can be here on the other side of this thing.
Thank you, Jatavia. The
Thank
sun
you so much.
on your face, it's kind of a perfect time, I think, to phase out. I also just wanted to thank everyone for being here. Obviously, Jatavia is brilliant, so it's been an honor.
You're brilliant.
And yeah, I just wanted to thank the Hammer and Paula Cooper for putting this together. I wanted to thank Vanessa Arizmendi,
Thank you, Vanessa.
and who has been supporting us through this entire project. And I wanted to also thank our incredible AV staff who
Shout out AV Club.
for this program and made it work, and it looks cute and everything.
Very cute.
So thank you, everyone. We will be posting the Q&A and conversation portion on the website, I think, in a day or so. So just look out for that. There might be an email also. And yeah, thank you for being here. It's time for dinner.
Stay safe. Take care.